All right, all you positive heads. On this week's Soul Share episode, I'm very excited to have John Burke here with me on the show. John is a New York Times best-selling author of the million-copy selling book Imagine Heaven, as well as his newer book, Imagine the God of Heaven. John has spoken around the world on topics of spiritual growth and the exhilarating life to come for us all. Hey there, John. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Hey, Brandon. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, looking forward to this. It's such a um it's such a amazing topic that you have helped to spread information around to the world. Uh One near and dear to my heart, so I'm really excited to dive in. If you would, please start off answering my cliche opening question, which is this. You're in an elevator, the woman next to you looks over, it says, "What's your passion?" You got 10 floors to answer. What do you say?
Oh man. Well, I think, what I'm now devoting my life to and what the last 35 years of my life has been is helping people see that the commonalities of these near-death experiences, which I've studied thousands of them over the
Mm-hmm.
last 35 years, are pointing toward something real, and they are evidence that this life is not the end, but the beginning. It's not
Yeah.
the last chapter of life. It's actually chapter one
Right.
of the real story of life
Right.
that's to come.
Right.
And there's a place more beautiful, a mystery and a wonder of the experiences that we're going to have together. Relationships don't end; they go deeper than ever.
Yeah.
And in the oversight of this God of love, who is a combination of your best friend and your most intimate lover all in one, which
Right.
is, which sounds weird and bizarre, but I mean, I've come to believe it's true.
I'm with you.
And
I
yeah,
100%
so
agree.
so my passion is pointing people to see that, hey, don't just get wrapped up in this life, in the mundane, in the day to day.
Yeah.
Missing your very purpose, and missing how much the one who created you loves you, and you're unique to God, and He's got you here for a reason.
Yeah.
But it's not the final reason.
Yeah. Right. Right. It's yeah, I agree with all of that. It's but wait, there's more. And I
Nah,
believe that's an
I know, and the
infinite.
problem is, she'd be like, "Okay, give me a shorter answer.
Yeah, right, right,
Let
right.
me get
Yeah,
off the elevator.
you gave the Willy Wonka
I got
answer
to
where
get
the
off the
elevator goes
elevator."
through the roof into
Yeah, that's the
space.
problem. Is I get going, and they're like, "Okay, I didn't need all that."
Fair. No, I'm with it. Well, yeah, it's such a fascinating topic, and to me, like you said, there's so much evidence. I had when this episode will come out, last week's episode was with someone who's a very big name in the forefront of consciousness and understanding consciousness on our planet, but is much more of a scientific, like isn't convinced there's that consciousness exists outside of the brain, and I'm just like, how is it possible that someone
Wow.
is intelligent with this pedigree with you're the forefront of understanding this thing, and but really, are you? Because like there's so much evidence,
Yeah, I
and
in fact, in my new book, Imagine the God of Heaven, I spend all of chapter two just talking about the 10 points of evidence that every alternate theory really has to take into account, or it's just throwing spaghetti at the wall
yeah,
and saying, well, I think it's this.
yeah,
And that's what most alternate theories really are. Unfortunately, they're not
yeah,
well thought out. They
yeah,
don't take into account all these points of evidence. And
yeah,
that's what convinced me, but it's also what's convinced many skeptical medical doctors that
yeah.
I've
Right.
gotten to know.
Right, right. Well, let's do this. Before we dive too deep here, I'd like to set the stage with helping, yeah, the audience and myself to understand, how did you get here? How did you get to the point of writing a book like this or books like this? And yeah, whatever feels relevant to share about your journey and your backstory.
Well, it did start, I started studying near death experiences well over 35 years ago. Um, I was, I was an agnostic. I worked as an engineer, so I was very skeptical and analytical.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, first of all, growing up, parents taking me to church, I thought, Jesus is a legend, and God, who knows,
Yeah.
you can't know. And that was the conclusion, because I was a very inquisitive person.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, how do you know, and why, and all that. It's just the way my mind works.
Yeah.
So I was always asking questions, and it seemed like no one either could or would take the time, to answer my questions. And so that's what I determined. And then my dad was dying of cancer,
Wow.
and I'm in his room one night, and I see on his bedside table Raymond Moody's book, the very first Life After Life, that first coined the
Yeah. I
term
had him
near-death
on the
experience.
show a while back.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah.
This is the very first research on near-death experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And I pick it up and I start reading it. Someone had given it to my father.
Yeah.
And I couldn't put it down. And at the end of that night, reading the whole book, I said, oh my gosh, like, this could be real evidence that this whole afterlife, God, Jesus stuff might be real.
Yeah.
Because of what people had said over and over again. Now, it didn't convince me. I was still skeptical.
Right.
And I had a lot of the things that I talk about in chapter 2 of the new book of, well, maybe it's just like hallucination.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's drugs that, you get in the hospital, or maybe it's the brain, anoxia. There's not enough oxygen to the brain, or maybe it's just a trick your brain's playing to, ease death.
Right.
And so, but I started studying them. And as I told you before the show, I lived out in Santa Barbara, and I worked as an engineer out there. I didn't know at the time, but this is in the late 80s, early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And Santa Barbara turned out to be kind of the hub of IANS, the International Association of Near-Death Experiences, and a lot of the research going on. A lot of people were kind of congregating there, and I kept running into these experiences. And so I started to do what I guess engineer types do, is I started to look at, well, where are they saying the same things? How do they overlap?
Mm-hmm.
And, are they all different? Are they the same? And so I just kind of started putting the puzzle pieces together. And like I said, I did my first talk on this. And by the way, along the way, I also started, studying the world's religions. I read the Bible. And I started to see that a lot of the commonalities of what they were saying were found in the Bible, and in some other scriptures too, but the most of them I found in the Bible. And I came to faith in Jesus during that time. And so my curiosity has always been, okay, how do the commonalities of these experiences align with what it says in the Bible? And so over 35 years, like I said, I've studied about over 1,000 of them. And in 2015, I finally wrote Imagine Heaven. And what I'm showing is that this incredible journey into the afterlife, and some of these incredible things that people say, they're already there. Like I've chronicled about 40 different commonalities of the experience of a near-death experience, and again, there's difference in depth. Bruce Grayson talks about depth of experience, but I'm talking about more than that. I'm talking about, what do they commonly say they see or feel or experience, and there are about 40 commonalities, and it's just amazing because they're there. They're there, revealed already in the wisdom literature of Scripture.
Yeah. Yeah, it is fascinating when you go back to some of these ancient texts and look at, some of the things that are being said, and sort of, of course, putting on the lens of hearing it in, modern terms. You know, a lot of times they spoke differently and used,
Right.
of course it's been translated and it's gone through all these filters, but you can, distill and discern. It's like, this is, even you get into some of the things like extraterrestrial life and things like that, and look at some of the things they were talking about with, disc in the sky or whatever,
Yeah.
it's really interesting to kind of think and take our
Well, and
modern.
I think in the early days of near-death experience research, one of the problems is a lot of Christians push them away. So
Yeah.
someone would have a near-death experience, and they would go to their church, they'd go to their pastor, their parish, or whatever, and what they got usually was just like wide eyes, deer, in the
Yeah.
headlights, and like, I don't know what that is, but it sounds spooky. Get away.
Yeah.
Or it's wrong, it's bad, satanic, and not many people were taking the time to really see. And let me give you some examples like that I chronicle in Imagine Heaven. But for instance, like the Apostle Paul wrote much of the New Testament, right?
Mm-hmm.
But nobody realizes really that, first of all, he was a skeptic. Like he was. This is very early, right after Jesus dies, is crucified and resurrected, and he is going and arresting these followers of Jesus and throwing them in prison because he thinks this is wrong, this is bad, right?
Yeah, right.
And it says in Acts chapter 9, this brilliant God of light appears to him on the road. Okay, sound familiar? If you're familiar with near-death experiences,
right.
This is the brilliant God of light, brighter than thousands of suns.
Yeah.
That again and again people talk about, and and he says, "Who are you, Lord?" And he says, "I'm Jesus." And then he doesn't really tell him anything else. And Paul comes back and he has to decide, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. So Paul then leaves Phariseeism, which the Pharisees were actually the ones who, I like to point this out because, a lot of people have a lot of hangups with religion because they've been hurt by people in religion or in the church. And I like to remind people that it was actually religious people who crucified Jesus in the name of God. So it doesn't mean that everyone, gets it right just because they're sitting in the garage called church or religion.
Sure.
But Paul, I think, had a near-death experience.
Yeah.
So then it says in Acts chapter 14, he was in Lystra, and this mob turns on him, stones him to death, drags him out of the city, and leaves him for dead. And then it says he gets back up and runs back into the city to try again, which I would not do.
Right.
It's like, but obviously this wasn't just somehow he came back with strength. Now, Paul then talks in a different book of the Bible, 2 Corinthians 12, about how 14 years ago, he says, and now listen to some of these things, whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, why doesn't he know? Well, because one of the commonalities is we still have this body. It's a spiritual body, but we're still ourselves.
Yeah.
In fact, we're more ourselves than we've ever been. And then he says, I was taken up into the third heaven, and I saw and I heard things inexpressible. And then he says, things no one is allowed to tell. Okay, now, first of all, if you've read enough, studied enough near-death experiences, they are describing things inexpressible. They're describing
there's no words kind of thing.
Colors,
right?
Colors beyond our color spectrum.
Yeah.
Senses that are blended. So, the flowers have aroma, but you can hear and see the aroma, and sounds have sights, and sights have sounds, and it's beauty not unlike the beauty of earth, but so far beyond it as well, and light that is life and love coming out of everything. Okay, so Paul says this, and then he says some things that no one's allowed to tell. Another commonality with near-death experiences is a lot of them will say things like, when I was there, like all my questions were answered, or, I knew how it all worked together and there was a plan and it's good. And then they'll say things like, but don't ask me to tell you now, because it was like that knowledge was veiled from me when I came back.
Yeah. Right.
So he's saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, then later he talks about how when we die, our bodies are buried a natural body. This is Paul, but they're raised a spiritual body. We're buried in weakness, but we're raised in, the Greek word is dunamos, power. So it's a body with new powers.
Right.
And some of the things are like telescopic eyesight.
Yeah.
Right. Now that's another one that you would think, okay, well, that's not in the Bible, but it actually is.
Yeah.
In Revelation chapter 21, John, who is one of the followers of Jesus, says he gets taken up into heaven, and he's on this great high mountain, which I write about in both books. A commercial airline pilot, like God lets him fly in over this city. Two of them had the same aerial flyover. I mean, isn't that cool?
Yeah.
God gives us what would appeal to us. And these two commercial airline pilots fly in, and they talk about this mountain range, vast, far greater than Mount Everest. So here's John in Revelation saying he's up on this very high mountain, and he's looking down at this city that in my new book, I have a Hindu guy who only knew the Hindu scriptures, and yet he's perfectly describing what Revelation 21 says. The city that John describes, and John can read the names on the foundation stones and over the gates. How? From up on a very high mountain, how are you going to read, unless you have like telescopic vision? So there are all these amazing commonalities.
It really is. I love the fact that you really look at it through the lens of, as it pertains and relates to the Bible, because you, of course, have so many people on our planet that, that almost acts as a barrier to their belief that there's, something other than you go, that's it. The day of judgment has happened, and you either made it or you didn't. And I'm curious if that's, where you've landed with your own philosophy around, based off all of your studies, what your thoughts are pertaining to the oneness of all things and source, God, the higher self, the universe, Jesus. It's all a part of the one, which I am, you are, it is us. And so that's my perspective on it. I believe I am that, and it is me and in another form. And I'm just curious where you've landed with that perspective, as it pertains to your, affinity, I suppose I could say, to religion.
Well, and that's a big part of what I'm trying to do in this new book, Imagine the God of Heaven, is, I'm starting off showing that, well, really throughout. I mean, what's amazing is I interviewed people, 70 different people for this new book on every continent, every religious background, not every culture, but vastly diverse cultures. And yet the things they're saying about not just their near-death experience, but they're all encountering this same God of light and love, who is personal, knows them personally. So like Santosh, who I was telling you about, he was a Hindu manufacturing engineer, traveled the world. He has his heart codes, and this brilliant light comes to him, and he says, this light I knew instantly had divine authority. This was a divine light. And he said, and I knew that it was protecting me and going to guide me and was for me. And so I fell in love with this light.
Yeah.
And then this light takes him, through the tunnels and, to this place. But like I said before, he's standing there looking at this light settling in over this. He called it a giant compound. I've been to India many times. If you've ever been to India, there are compounds everywhere. They're like walled, compounds where there are
Yep.
buildings in it and all that.
Yeah.
He said, but this compound was thousands of miles huge, and these high, gorgeous walls, and inside these magnificent buildings and gorgeous architecture, but of otherworldly building materials, which is fascinating because he was a structural engineer, a manufacturing engineer.
Yeah. Wow.
And then he says, and 12 gates, and I counted them. So he said, your eyesight's telescopic there.
Wow.
And he said, and I wanted to go into this place. This is like the goal of life, to live there and to be there. And he saw people and he saw angels, and he sees angels guarding the gates. And he said, I knew I was looking at the kingdom of heaven.
Cool.
And so he has this overwhelming experience too of God, and God saying, I'm going to send you back. And he says, when you go back, I want you to love your family, and especially your daughter. She needs your help right now.
Wow.
Okay, so here's the fascinating thing. So Santosh didn't know who this God was. He said he didn't represent the Hindu gods he had studied growing up.
Mm-hmm.
He had incredible compassion, love,
Mm-hmm.
mercy, kindness. He was personal. He said he knew everything about me, even things I had forgotten. He showed me.
Mm-hmm.
He hadn't forgotten.
Yeah.
And so he comes back and he starts reading the Bible and said, everything I experienced, I found in there.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's crazy, but you've got the same thing. Bibi in Tehran, again, she has a heart attack. She's standing there before this same similar God that Santosh describes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, she's a Muslim related to the Prophet Muhammad,
Mm-hmm.
very well to do,
Mm-hmm.
in Tehran.
Mm-hmm.
And this God comes to her, and she's expecting judgment. So
Mm-hmm.
the whole mindset is, you're going to be judged by one of the caliphs.
Yeah.
That's what she was waiting for. And instead she sees this divine presence, but appeared like a man, she said, but he said to her, I am he who is.
Mm-hmm.
And boom, she's back in her body.
Mm.
Okay, so that's bizarre, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's exactly what the God of light said, who appears to Moses in this, he called it this burning bush that wouldn't burn.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a brilliant light that looks like fire, but it's not burning like fire, right?
Right.
And he says to him, I am who is. I am the eternal one. So it's the same thing.
I am.
Said the same thing to another near-death experiencer, Penny. Just I am. And she was like, whoa, dude, you are. Like, who else can say that?
I love that. I remember seeing Wayne Dyer talk about this years ago, and it really stuck with me. He talked about, this in the Bible, I think it's quoted as I am that I am. And he's like, if you break it up even and think of it in terms of, it kind of goes along with what I was saying earlier, my core belief that everywhere I go, I'm there waiting for myself. I am that. I am that. And then at some point you can just drop that I am. I am that I am. It's like we are fractals of the source consciousness, the one source consciousness that creates and animates all things, I believe. So it's like that pertains to us as well. I believe.
Well, so I think I've come to land on something probably in between, kind of the so a lot of Christians would say there's complete separateness,
right? That's where I being raised very conservative Christian, going to a Christian college, coming from a family that's my father door knocked up until COVID, well into his 70s, inviting people to his church every Sunday. And that's really where we departed. Is I believe all separation is an illusion. At the end of the day, there's only one of us. And
well, and so if you look at near-death research, it says both and.
Right. So divine dichotomy, I call it. You and I are separate. That is true. You and I are one I believe that is also true, depending
Yeah.
on the vantage point from which we're speaking. So, at some level, of course, there's so much evidence and experiences, whether NDEs, near death experience, or plant medicines or meditation, where people are connecting and being it all. And so, yeah,
Yeah. So, but what a lot of people don't realize is like, um, Jesus' last prayer on earth before he goes to the cross is, you know, Father, I pray that they may all be one as you and I are one.
Yep.
Just as I am in you and you are in me, may they be in us, so
Yeah.
the world may believe you sent me.
Or remember
So,
that they already are, in a sense. Like, like he stood before, was it Pontius Pilate, when he was, about to, defend yourself. You're running around saying you're God, which, by the way, is the exact same thing I'm saying here. I'm one with the source consciousness. You're God, and you're saying you're God. What do you got to say for yourself? And he said, isn't it written in your old text, ye are gods? So his defense even was saying, look, even the old text that you, Pontius Pilate, subscribe to says ye are gods. So,
well, it wasn't Pontius Pilate. He was
wasn't.
talking to he was talking to the Hebrew Pharisees
Oh, okay.
who are going to have him
Okay, maybe
who
I
are
haven't
going to
confused.
have him crucified.
Got it.
Yeah, and I think what he's referring to, what he's saying is, and I think this matches both what's in the Bible, but also what near-death experiencers say, is that when we come from God. So like it says in the Bible, before you were born, I knew you.
Right. You're an eternal being that's always been and always will be. Time
So
is
we've
illusion.
always been in the mind of God or the creative impetus of God. Another commonality of near-death experiencers, of course, is that time on the other side doesn't work the same way.
Well,
Some
and we
say
see that even with physics, they show it's illusory. If you shoot me in outer space at light speed and bring me back a day later, I'm a day older and you've been gone for 100 years.
Yeah,
it's relative.
Relativity.
Yeah, right.
But also, so I postulate something else in both books, that in 2 Peter 3:8, Peter, another follower of Jesus, says, to the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's exactly what near-death experiencers say. And I've interviewed enough of them that some of them say there is no time, but some of them say, no, there was time, but there's all the time you need.
Yeah.
Time is not rushed. And that's fascinating if you think about, I go into just the thought of, what if we only experience time in one dimension, linearly in one direction, right? But what if we experience time in two dimensions?
Right.
Okay, so think about it. You've got this timeline that can only go one way, moment to moment, and you can never go back.
Yeah.
Right, on that timeline. But if you had two dimensions of time, at every point of our single dimension of time, there'd be another line going up.
Yeah. Right.
Infinitely. And so for every moment of what we call Earth time, you would have all the time in the world to spend at that moment before going to the next moment.
Right.
And if you could go back and forth, then it feels like, well, time's irrelevant, or there's no time. And then think about this. If you wrap that two-dimensional time into a third dimension of time, okay? So imagine a globe now. Imagine, horizontal time is on the equator, and then the second dimension or the longitude lines going up to the North Pole. And the North Pole is a single point of third dimensional time that experiences all the second dimensional and one dimensional time all at the same point in time. And then you think about, Jesus says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end.
Right.
All at the same point of time.
Right. Which really implies what would be external of the one that, I always will often say that when people, I feel get caught up on this separation thing. And I'm like, hold on, well, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning, there, what would be external of source, God, whatever you want to refer to, the universe, higher self, consciousness, all names pointing love, all names pointing at the same thing.
Yeah, so I think there is a truth to this oneness,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the oneness that will unite us all is the love of God.
Agreed.
And the love of God is not, I mean, we use the word love, but it just falls so far short.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
like,
Right.
I mean, I've had near-death experiencers tell me, like, our love. This one guy who's a neurologist who was stabbed 13 times when he was a psychiatrist. One of his patients turned and stabbed him.
Wow.
13 times, but before the 14th blow, time stops, he said, and down this quarter of light before him, completely blocking his attacker, is this brilliant light, like standing 5 feet from a nuclear explosion.
Yeah.
Is what he
Right.
said.
Wow.
And but I totally derailed. Where was I going with that?
Where were you going with that?
Okay. So what I was going to say is that these people in God's presence, they experience both. So they experience both a oneness with this God and a connection to all others. One guy, this Dr. Eby, said it was like the every computer terminal connected by the internet.
Yeah. Right.
Right. And so there is an understanding and a heart to heart thought and connection with all things through God. And yet they're still themselves.
Yep.
And I think that's an important part, because that's where it does
Wonderful
differ.
part. You get to be unique and it and the one.
And so there is that separateness, but a oneness together. And I think that's exactly what Jesus was
I saw the quote once. It was like, you are unique, exactly like everyone else. So we're the exact same in our uniqueness.
Well, except imagine, so this one commercial airline pilot, Jim, and another guy, Randy, a CEO, they both said the same thing. In fact, multiple people, they said, in God's presence, I felt like I was the only one he loved. The way Dean, this
I've
one
heard
guy,
that too.
as
well.
he said, I felt like I was the only one he loved. And not only that, when I looked into his eyes, his love for me was growing.
Wow.
It's like everything about him was, and he's looking into the eyes of Jesus. And he said, I was getting lost in his eyes, and the light of Jesus was brighter than the sun. And the light was wrapping around me, like hugging me.
Wow.
And he said, I never realized that his love for me is unique, personal, and growing.
Yeah.
Now, and now that was the same as what two others I interviewed said, that I would think about someone else and I would see, like, I'd think about my wife and I would see that, oh, he loves her like she's the only one.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'd think about someone else and, oh, he loves, and this is interesting because Dean was a teen probation officer in the court system. So he worked with teens who had been through a lot.
Yeah.
And one of the things he told me he had seen that did more damage than anything else was sexual child abuse.
Yeah.
And he said, just causes so much trauma and, and so he's in Jesus' presence and he thinks even child molesters. That's interesting.
Yeah. And that's a tricky one for people to really understand.
Well, and so this is important because this also comes together with the justice of God, which we want God to be just, by the way, especially when injustice has been done to us.
Sure, yeah.
But he thinks about this, and kind of like you can't love them.
Yeah.
And that was the
most. That's why they're doing what they're doing.
Well, that was the first time. That was the first time Jesus looks at him. He said, and said very sternly, who are you to negate what I have done?
Mm. Yeah, when you start to understand, I often say the most controversial thing I ever say on this podcast is there's never been a victim in all of eternity. I don't believe. I believe it's always happening for us, not to us, and by divine design that we are privy to co-authoring. And that's challenging, and I get it. And especially if you've been through intense trauma, the last thing you want to hear is like, oh, you did it to yourself, you know? And so I think that doesn't mean you go around, you know, without heart or understanding that, you know, trauma is very real and, you know, this cripples people. And, you know, underneath it all, that's truly what I believe. And it really helps to bring some, there will be an answer, you know.
Well, and I would
There
agree
will be
with
a why that you makes it.
I would
Makes
agree
sense.
with that with a nuanced difference.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that I don't think everything that happens on this earth is God's will.
So
Well,
I'll ask you this. It's a great question.
So I don't think people molesting their children,
mhm.
God is like, yeah, thumbs up. No, I think he's heartbroken that one child who he loves intensely would do that to another child he loves intensely. And I believe that is exactly what Jesus was saying to Dean. I died for everyone.
Yeah.
And even a child molester who turns from that and turns
Mm-hmm.
to me can be
Mm-hmm.
forgiven. And God wants to walk with all of us in this intimate, loving relationship to help us become who he created us to be.
Yeah. I would say it's back to this divine dichotomy that there. Yeah, I would agree with you that source God is saying, go this direction. This is where, and, you know, for a moment, back to the idea, we're in eternity, no time. A trillion years hasn't even, a moment has passed. It hasn't even begun yet. That's beyond our little measly brains to even comprehend. And,
Yeah.
I believe from it's from what perspective are we speaking? You know, from you know, one perspective, absolutely, that is not the path to lead to fulfillment, and it leads to injury and harm. And from a broader vision, understanding that the sweet is never quite as sweet without the sour, and who and what we are is not for the faint of heart. We are eternal beings. You know, imagine, you know, I use the story of my brother when he was in his early 20s, he got a ticket for having an open container on the beach, drinking a beer at like 21 on the beach, and got a ticket, and he didn't pay it. And years went by and he forgot about it, and he got pulled over, and they're like, oh, there's a warrant for your arrest. Now,
gosh,
he's one of, if not the most sensitive people I know. Now here he is in jail for days with, like, you know, gangsters and people looking at him
Wow.
funny, and he's just like, oh, you know, like, what have I done?
Freaking
What am I
out.
doing here? I pick him up they let him out at 12:01 a.m. so they can charge another day. He'd been there 4 or 5 days, whatever it was. I bring him home. I cook him a hot pocket. And to this day, he's had a lot
7-Eleven
of
Hot Pocket.
Yeah, he's had a lot of Michelin meals and incredible meals. If you ask him what was the best meal you ever had, guess what he'll say? Because of the contrast, that hot pocket, because of the contrast. The sweet is never quite as sweet without the sour. If you're an infinite being that's always been and always will be, and love is it, but there's no contrast, love becomes meaningless. It needs the contrast, I believe, in order for it to mean anything. So you can't know that what you are unless you know that what you are not. So the pain, hurt, harm is all actually happening as a tool for love to have meaning.
I agree.
That's what so is it bad, or is it divine design, as Jesus said in that vision? So from what perspective are we speaking, you know? And there is a perspective where that is not the path. If you want to experience goodness and fulfillment and not experience the energetic repercussions of, you know, doing this awful thing that we all can agree we don't want to experience, and yet at some part of us, I believe it is authored and divinely designed so that, the higher the branches, the deeper the roots, the greater the light, the bigger the shadow it casts.
Well, and so I would agree in the sense of that we are bound in a time capsule, right? So divine beings are not, the angels, the demonic, God is not bound by time like we are.
Yeah.
And we are experiencing something unique, I believe, for a limited time.
Yeah.
And that is both the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil. And I think near-death experiencers really show this, because for a time we're experiencing a very muted taste of heaven and a very muted taste of hell. And there are hellish near-death experiences too.
Sure.
You
Yeah.
got to take into account. And I think we're in the place of choosing. And choosing what? And what's the point?
Yeah.
Well, what near-death experiences are very clear about is the point is love, that God is love.
Agreed.
And in every life review, every single time, I haven't had one yet
Yeah.
that didn't say what God cares most about is how we treat one another, how we love one another, and that's the most important thing, because there are ripple effects across humanity to our small acts of kindness or our meanness as well. So I think we're living, and if you think about it, love is a weird property, if you call it a property. Love cannot be real love and be forced or coerced or bought.
Yeah.
So I can love somebody and I can buy them great gifts and hope they'll love me back, but maybe they just love the gifts instead of me. Or, I could try to manipulate and coerce, but that if it's not freely given back, it's not real. Even you can't put a gun to someone's head and say, live with me in love and tell me you love me. Well, maybe they do out of fear, but that's not love either. And here's the point. That's true for God as well.
Yeah.
So God is love, and out of the overflow of love, he creates, or he extends his love to the other, and we are the other, though we come from him, so we are also one, right? I mean, that's the mystery of it.
It's quite perplexing, and it's like, and you use the word evil. What is evil spelled backwards? Live. Like, it's like these two sides of the same coin. One can't exist without the other, I believe. There is no love if it's all that there is, right? So if there is evil or darkness or, the opposite of love, from whence did it come? Where is the origin if I trace it back to its roots? If I go back to the root of the root of the root of the root, where did it come from?
So my philosophy of it, and it's just my philosophy,
sure.
is that God chose to create in love for love, and therefore God had to choose to limit himself to allow free will creatures to choose.
Yeah.
And so there's a reality that we can choose to shoot the bird at God and say, I'm God and I don't need you. And I think that is, and I think that, and I've got multiple near-death experiencers in this new book who say in God's presence, they experience the heartbreaking sadness of God over people he loves, children he created to be his children, who would reject him.
Yeah. Well, are you familiar with the book Conversations with God? Neil Donald Walsh. I had him on the show a while back and I asked him, he's written like 20 some books. I'm like, do you know what my favorite book of yours is? And he started guessing. I was like, nope. The children's book, The Little Soul in the Sun. And I always say every kid from 9 to 99 should read this book. And really, just to kind of give you a quick summary of it, it's like, it is the sun represents God in this, metaphor. and all the lights, that candles that make up the sun are in eternity, and they're all equally brilliant and magnificent and wonderful, and they can barely stand to look at one another, the glory and beauty of it all. And then there's this adventurous light that has an idea of something in this eternally blissful state that hasn't cropped up before, and he has the idea of experiencing a new concept, a new emotion, a new energy, forgiveness. And he starts having a conversation with the sun, which represents, the God, the conglomerate of it all. And God says, little light, you always were the adventuresome one. I knew you'd come up with this. And there is a way. We'll create a place where you can go to. And however, it will take another one of your brilliant brothers or sisters, their brilliant light. They'll have to dim their light. They'll have to slow down the vibration and forget who they are in order to do an awful thing to you, so that you can have the opportunity to forgive. And another light steps forward and says, I love you so much, I'm willing to completely lose and forget myself in this realm that we'll create, and go down and do this awful thing so that you can have the opportunity. And all I ask in the moment of doing this awful thing to you is that you remember me as I am here and now, because I will have completely lost myself. And if you forget too, we may both be lost for a very long time. And so it's such a, I highly recommend everyone reading it. It's, that's just really paraphrasing it. But this idea that the evil, the darkness, the one that is giving you something to experience this concept of forgiveness, is loved you so much that they've suffered and lost themselves to the light in order to give you that contrast and that experience. And now you start thinking about it from that perspective, and it's like, so it's a tool for love. It's all happening for love. And
I would agree.
It's all a gift, and it's tough. It's like I said, it's not for the faint of heart what we are.
No.
And it really brings me great peace to know, that the darkness is really, it's an illusion to make the Hot Pocket taste good, and at the end of the day, when all the puzzle pieces go back in the box, it's like, it is all for love, and we all are love. And because we experience that contrast, that pain, that darkness, we really understand, its meaning. It has a different flavor to it.
Well, it's interesting because Paul says in Romans 8 that all of the suffering, all of this temporary suffering, I count as nothing in comparison to the glory that we will experience.
It's a small price to pay. It's a small price to pay in order for the upside that we all experience as souls.
Yeah, and those are some of the things that I'm trying to help people see in Imagine the God of Heaven, is that what is to come is everything on this planet, just in our lives. So we all want love. I mean, just look at the number of love songs. Like, it's crazy. Like, aren't we tired of them yet? No.
No, we'll never get tired of them.
No. And there are very few that would doubt that love seems to be the central organizing, motivating factor.
Agreed.
Love, acceptance, forgiveness, all these, it's relational at the core.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating too is that this, like some of my favorite NDE stories that I bring in to the book are people who are blind, and blind from birth.
Yeah, and then they can see,
And they can see in their near-death experience, and they see and report the same things as sighted people all around the globe.
Amazing. It's amazing.
But they also say that the light of heaven, so like there's this woman, Debbie, and she's in the presence of God, and there's this light, not only of God, but light coming out of the grass, coming out of the birds, coming out of the trees, coming out of the flowers, even coming out of people. And what I correlate is that, what people commonly say is that the light of God is not light like the sun. And blind people are saying the same thing. It's not like light of the sun. It's light that is also life and also love.
Yeah.
All is one.
Yeah.
And it's coming out of everything. Here's what's fascinating. And they also say there's no sun or moon. Well, that's exactly what the Jewish prophet Isaiah said in Isaiah 60. It's what John says in Revelation 21. It says, in heaven, there is no sun or moon. The glory of God is its light, and the nations will walk in that light. So this light coming out of everything is the life and the love of God flowing through everything. Jesus said in Matthew 13, then they will shine like the stars in their Father's kingdom forever. So it says this is light coming out of even out of us.
Yeah.
And so think about, and the reason I point that out is because, God is creator. And just look at the world.
Yeah.
And look at the beauty. Look at the little tastes of love or joy or ecstasy or fun or pleasure
It's art,
or excitement.
It's poetry. It's,
But here's the thing, Brandon, that I feel like is craziness is that people disassociate that from God.
Yeah.
They somehow think, no, we figured out how to have fun or how to have pleasure or how to enjoy life or love but no, he created all that.
Well, when you think of it in the terms that I do, it's like we are God-godding. This is how God experiences herself. We are it. Then anything that I create is God's creation. It is, back to
and I talk about that in the last part of the book, that God is the God of joy. The very last thing Jesus said on earth, he said, I'm telling you these things so that my joy would be in you and your joy would overflow.
Yeah.
And joy is not something, and happiness is dependent on happenings, right? It's like we're happy when things go well around us.
Yeah.
But no, we're talking about a joy that can come even
Peace.
when things aren't going well.
Peace.
Well, it's
we can always choose to be at peace. Happiness all the time is not the formula. Once again, where's the contrast? It's necessary.
And so, what I'm trying to do in Imagine the God of Heaven is help people realize that we all put God in a box because we're finite.
Yeah.
And so we've got walls to our imagination of God. And, many Christians, maybe they'll say all these things that he's omniscient and omnipotent and all power, transcendent and immanent, and you got all these big words, but he's far greater than that and far more mysterious, and this infinite light that is amazing. But then the other side is he's way more personable, relatable, even fun, enjoyable, funny.
Right.
I mean, how many near-death experiencers they talk about? I love, one of my favorite ones is this young Jewish girl. She's not young anymore, but so she grows up with an atheist father who was very abusive. And he had a mantra. Every night he would tell his three girls, there is no God. Your life is worth less than a speck of dust. And Jesus is the biggest hoax ever perpetrated on mankind. Every night she hears this.
Wow.
But she always prayed to God. Every night she prays. And she felt like God was real and there and comforted her. This is as a child, an abused child, right? And then at 16, her horse crushes her, falls back on her, crushes her. She's up above her body, 30 feet. And she knew she was dead, but she felt great. She sees a light over her shoulder. And she turns and looks, and there's Jesus. But he's a light brighter than the sun, but she knew he's Jesus. And she said, it wasn't like I was thinking, what's a good Jewish girl like me doing with Jesus? I'm not supposed to be with Jesus.
Right.
Instead, she said, I knew this man. I knew him. And it was like a reunion, and he gives her a life review and shows her as a little girl when she was praying at night, he's there beside her.
Yeah.
He's there.
Yeah.
Now, here's the fun part though. So she loves speed. You know, she would ride horseback, bareback, just flying, right? She was
Yeah.
kind of a speed freak.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus, and this is my point of that, God breaks our bounds. You know, he's a lot more fun than we imagine.
Mm-hmm.
So he gets this big grin on his face, and she said he grabs her hand and they take off.
Yeah.
And they are flying at first past. You know, people always have this idea you travel through a tunnel. Well, not always.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like through our atmosphere and then straight out into outer space.
Yeah. Right.
But in a dimension that's outside of our understanding.
Yep.
So it's the dimension all around us. So here she goes, and they are flying like at the speed of sound, the speed of light, she said. But it was like, she said, surfing a wave of light.
Yeah.
And she said, I could feel it on my feet. I was barefoot and I could feel it. And I'm looking at Jesus, and he's got this big grin on his face. And she said, we were laughing the whole time. And he was saying, isn't this the most fun? And she said, it was the most fun I've ever had in my whole life.
Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah. It's fascinating, you know, how these different people from, you know, different walks of life and different experiences. It's like the dad doing that is a great example of what I was speaking to, right? Of here, he handed her darkness every day, dark perspective. And then now here comes the contrast. Oh, how much more beautiful and meaningful is it to her to have had that experience after the gift of what he offered. And by the way, he loved her enough to suffer in order to get to the state where he's that disconnected and that forgotten his origins, that he's like literally preaching that to her nightly because that was his truth and what he was feeling, and what you know, and suffered for that contrast ultimately. And what a sacrifice, what a gift. And now you start looking at it through that lens, and it's like, oh, it's all happening for love. Like,
well, she came back and felt so loved and healed by God, because Jesus then takes her into this infinite light that she knows is God. Mm-hmm. And she says, but Jesus too, but I don't know how God can be light and God can be man and God can be alive. I don't know, she said, but that's what I experienced. Mm-hmm. But she comes back and is able to offer her father forgiveness and love.
Yeah.
And he didn't, he pushed it away. But last year, and Heidi and I are good friends now. Last year on his deathbed, he acknowledged the wrongs he had done toward her.
Yeah. Wow.
And he
redemption.
He opened his heart to God. Redemption
is inevitable. It's not if, but when. This life, another life. You know, you're in eternity, and it's, you know, I had Paul Selig on a few times on this podcast, and he's a channel, and his texts are really, you know, books are just straight, no editing, just straight channel material supposedly, and they're really potent and powerful. And one of the things that's coming through him is, I make all things new. I make all things new. I make all things, you know, and it's like the Father ultimately gets made new, right? The redemption is. It isn't over if we haven't won, I believe. And so that's a beautiful story and share. And speaking of stories, as we start to wind down here, perhaps you have a story up your sleeve of, you know, personal synchronicity, serendipity, positive paranormal story that you care to share.
Wow. There's so many.
Yeah.
You know, here's an interesting thing. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was thinking about this because, you know, studied thousands of these people who have clinically died, you know, no heartbeat, brain waves. They have these incredible mystical experiences, right? And they come back changed.
Yeah.
And I, you know, commonly say, I've never had anything like that. I don't get mystical experiences, you know, and I've asked God about that, like, okay, why, you know, and I got the idea that I made you this way for a reason. You're a bridge, meaning I'm I'm bridging the more analytical,
Mm-hmm.
science minded,
Necessary.
like
Yeah.
how does this make sense with the more mystical and all that. But here was my moment of aha.
Mm-hmm.
Is I had this thought, don't say that anymore. And I was like, why? And the thought was, you
You're a
do hear the
creator.
voice. You
You're a
do hear
creator.
the voice of God.
Yeah. You're creating.
And so here's what I did is I sat down and I started listing the times that I had heard the voice of God. And I came up with 100.
Wow.
100 that I chronicled. And I'll just give you one. Okay. So, like I said, I was an engineer. When I'm living out in Santa Barbara, and I'm working there, and I'm learning these things, and I come back, and my roommate was a communications coach,
Mm-hmm.
and I get excited about. You can tell I get excited about stuff, right? And I'm telling him what I've learned, and he goes, "Man, I think you have a gift of teaching."
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, "No, Dave, no.
Mm-hmm.
I am terrified of public speaking. Never gonna do it.
Yeah.
Not gonna do it."
Yeah.
For months, he kept saying, let me coach you. And I kept saying, no.
Yeah.
And then one day I'm praying and I have a thought come into my mind. When you resist Dave, you resist me.
Mm.
And I knew I didn't think that thought because that terrified me.
Right.
And I say that because the thought came again.
Mm-hmm.
And on the third time I said, okay. Now, when I first started, it was horrible. It was horrible. It was as bad as I was fearing.
Yeah, right.
But I've now spoken to hundreds of thousands of people in 30 countries.
Wow. Yeah.
And I look at that. I don't say that bragging. I say that going, oh my gosh.
Fear, forget everything and run, or face everything and rise, right?
And that God is speaking to us in our inner person if we'll listen, if we'll slow down and get quiet and really listen for his voice.
Yeah. If it scares you and excites you, I often will say it's probably for you. We're being pushed to overcome those things. So, because you were able to overcome that fear, look at the ripple of impact. That's one of the things that I love the most about. I always jokingly say I do all the dharmic work I do, with this podcast, and have helped a lot of people to shift their perspectives to create more magic in their lives. And I say, I do it because I'm selfish. I'm just looking forward to that afterlife party where I get to see and feel. I'm sure you've heard this before. People being shown, here's who you impacted, and here's who they impacted as a part of that ripple. True ROI, the ripple of impact, is everything, and you get to see and feel energetically that in your life review. I'm sure you've seen and heard this, and I'm ready for the seeing and feeling anyone that I had a positive impact on, and hopefully making good on anyone that I didn't.
Well, and back to your point, that's where there's forgiveness.
Yeah, right.
God did what he did through Jesus, I believe, to forgive everyone of everything.
Yeah. I always say with Jesus, and of course, with a Christian perspective, to me, it creates a little bit of a barrier to this is a conduit to source. And I believe when Jesus was a man, and when he said, I'll come back, Christ is a state of consciousness, like Buddha consciousness, like it's literally tapping into your divinity. And so I believe Christ's consciousness is coming back. It's here now. I mean, I've looked over the last 20 years, 25 years of my own spiritual journey. And at first I would talk about these ideas of oneness and, source consciousness and everything. And people would be like, what are you smoking? And now I turn around, and every 21-year-old at an event I'm hosting or whatever, yeah, of course I know I'm God. I'm one with God. Like, that's old news. So there is an awakening and a remembering. I believe Christ consciousness is permeating the planet now, and it is back, or as Paul Selig's book, I have come. It's here and wants to permeate each and every one of us and find the Christed self within us. Whew, what a journey. What an awesome episode. So grateful to hear your perspectives on this topic and seeing it through your unique lens. I think it's so necessary to be that bridge, like you said, to the people who take someone like myself. I'm just too far out, that bridge is too weird, but I can handle John, and I think that's a beautiful thing. It's all
Well,
needed.
and that's the challenge maybe I'd give your audience, is that I know there are a lot of people who are raised around church or the Bible or all this, and honestly have rejected it and become kind of closed to the fact that maybe there's more integration than I've realized. I mean, when you get hurt, it's hard not to shut down and close off. But don't mistake people for Jesus.
Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater,
Exactly.
And I think a lot of people do that.
Yeah. We're all still learning.
Yeah. What is the best way for those who'd like to connect with you and continue learning through your offerings to the world and just follow you?
I'm you can go to imaginethegodofheaven.com. So it's just the book title, imaginethegodofheaven.com.
Cool.
And got different things, different connections out there and what I'm doing.
Amazing.
All that.
Well, John, I do have one final question, my cliche closer. And it is this: in 60 seconds or less, what is the meaning of life according to John Burke?
Love.
My favorite quote.
To love God, to love people.
My favorite quote, I did a remix of a John Lennon quote, and it's, love is the answer now. What was the question? So I agree with you.
But it's much tougher than our word gives credit for.
Yeah. I mean, it's like Mike Tyson.
So there's the caveat.
Mike Tyson said, everyone's got a plan till you get punched in the face. And that's really where the work comes. Like, okay.
Well, I love, I don't want to go too far, but I love the quote of a friend of mine, Howard Storm, who has this incredible near-death experience. And he's told to come back and love, and that will change the world. And when he was told he's got to come back, he still has a purpose. And he said, what's his purpose? Love the person you're with. And he's going, hey, got that.
Yeah.
And he's an artist. So he's like, I'll build you a cathedral. How about that? Like, that's what artists do, right? It's
right.
Like, and God's like, no,
I'm good.
I don't need that.
I'm good.
And he said, yeah, but look, these grand cathedrals for you. He said, well, that wasn't really for me.
Yeah, right.
And he said, I just want you to love the person around you. And I love this because, in God's presence, we can be ourselves. So Howard argues with him.
Yeah.
He's like, what good's that going to do?
Yeah.
That's not going to work.
Yeah, right.
And he goes, no, that's going to change the world.
Yeah.
And he said, that's not going to change the world. I mean, one cold-hearted person is going to hurt somebody else, is going to derail the whole thing. He said, well, you're not the only ones in this plan.
Yeah, right.
There are millions of people and millions of angels. Just love the person around you.
Yeah. Conversations with God says, I have sent you nothing but angels. And that's a really interesting, back to our evil darkness, whatever, the dad who told her the thing, like, is it an angel? I would say so, at the deepest root of what's going on. And it's all happening for love. And I appreciate you, John. Thank you so much for taking the time to do the work that you do and sharing here so graciously on today's show. And all of you out there.
Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you. And all of you out there for tuning your beautiful brainwaves and incredible hearts into another episode. Until next time, journey well.